We won the battle for marriage equality, but will we now fight for marriage itself? What was the real promise of same-sex marriage? The advocates who won the hearts and minds of millions of Americans argued that marriage was a civilizing force, one that same-sex couples needed not as a rejection of tradition, but as an embrace of it. Yet even before the ink was dry on the Supreme Court's ruling, our culture moved in the opposite direction, abandoning monogamy as an expectation and treating marriage as just one of many possible relationship models. This 6-part series traces the journey from the origins of the marriage equality movement, the role monogamy played in building civilization, why it's important for the LGBT community, and how we can keep the promise of same-sex marriage. The journey begins with The Little Bishop Who Changed the World, a deeply personal reflection on the day that should have felt like a victory, but instead felt like a funeral. As I watched Bishop Gene Robinson celebrate an achievement that had defined an era, I felt the weight of my own disillusionment. My marriage to an Episcopal priest had become a casualty, not only of personal betrayal, but of a movement and a church that had fought for our rights, but had never reckoned with the obligations that marriage demanded. Same-sex marriage had arrived, but instead of embracing the institution as it was, we treated it as a trophy, a victory for social justice. The second article, The Conservative Case for Marriage Equality, explores how the argument for same-sex marriage was, ironically, a fundamentally conservative one, arguing that marriage was about commitment, fidelity, and social stability, values conservatives claim to champion. And yet, when victory was achieved, conservatives surrendered. By refusing to explicitly defend monogamy, they abandoned the very moral framework they had promised would sustain marriage itself. In the next chapter, The Forgotten Vow looks at monogamy as the defining characteristic of marriage. We explore the growing movement against monogamy and the growing interest in ethical non-monogamy. One by one, we confront and dismantle the arguments critics make against monogamy and how it holds promise to transform the LGBT community. The next chapter, Monogamy, the social technology that built civilization, reveals how monogamy has been essential to the values we cherish. Western civilization itself was shaped by monogamy. If we discard monogamy, we risk losing more than just an ideal of romantic exclusivity. We risk unraveling the social fabric that has sustained democracy, equality, and cooperation across generations. The next article, The High Cost of Sexual Liberation, examines the tangible costs of prioritizing sexual freedom over committed relationships. From rising STD rates to deepening loneliness, the consequences of treating sex as transactional rather than transformative are severe. The culture that once fought for love now risks losing it entirely in the pursuit of pleasure without meaning. A new cultural paradigm is desperately needed, one that restores a sexual ethic centered on monogamy, not as a relic, but as the fulfillment of the promise of same-sex marriage. And the final article, Who Will Lead the Episcopal Church's Forgotten Mission, brings the discussion full circle. If same-sex marriage was won on the premise of commitment, then it is now the responsibility of those who fought for it to ensure that commitment is upheld. The Episcopal Church, which played a pioneering role in LGBT inclusion, is uniquely positioned to lead this cultural renewal. It has the credibility, the reach, and the theological grounding to champion a return to monogamy. Not out of dogma, but out of a recognition that love, in its highest form, is about choosing one person, forsaking all others, and building something lasting. It is time to reclaim what was won, not just as a right, but as a responsibility. I hope you will join me in calling on the Episcopal Church to defend same-sex marriage. It is time for the Episcopal Church to lead the way toward making marriage truly equal.